directly.
Perfetto, adesso stiamo iniziando. Prego, Caroline.
Okay, I'm going to go directly to sharing my screen, where hopefully I have the PowerPoint in place. Can you see that, everybody?
We can see it. Yes, we can see. Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah. Okay. So, last time for everybody, or for the few of you that were here last time, we closed the meeting in Canto 33 of the Paradiso. So we were, right at the very end of Dante's long and arduous quest. But tonight we're going to go not only back to the beginning, but before the beginning, and look at Dante's early life. So without further ado, we'll go on to the first slide. I'm going to start with the quote from Helen Vendler that I put in the description, but for those people who may not have had a chance to read the description, I'll read it out for you, because it really is the basis of the presentation tonight. So Helen Vendler says, Dante, as is universally recognized, gave to the West a myth whereby the love of a woman could lead to the love of God, and the arrival at the love of God no longer required the recantation of the love of woman, as it formerly had been in Christian thought. So he's going to do something really unique. It will be a journey that spans his entire life, and a goal that he won't reach until he's practically at the end of that life. So this evening, we're going to look at Dante's very early life. We're going to look at his very first glimpse of his beloved Beatrice, and to the struggles and personal pain he endured as he made his transition from what we might call a love-struck teenager who was utterly, utterly captured by the allure of courtly love, the vogue at the time, through the very, very long years of grief and debilitation that followed after Beatrice's early and tragic death. And then we're going to go onward to his realization that comes toward the end of the book. We're going to be discussing La Vita Nuova, where he comes to the realization that actually love, when understood aright, can actually be a force that can ultimately lead to the embrace of the divine. So that's really the story we're going to be looking at this evening. So to sum up, love will lead Dante to paradise, to the deep truth that he's known all along. But La Divina Commedia, his great work, begins a long, 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 long way from heaven's highest heights. In medias res, as the Greeks might have said, in the very middle of things, where we find Dante lost and afraid in the wastes of Canto 1 Inferno. These are the very famous lines which we all know from the beginning of Dante's Commedia, where he explains his plight. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la dirita via era smarrita. In the middle of the journey of our life, he explains, I came to myself within a dark wood where the straightway path was lost. I cannot well repeat how there I entered in, he tells us. So full was I of slumber at that moment. Or without warning then, it seems to Dante, and perhaps to us too, at our own midlife, that suddenly we find ourselves lost. But in order to understand why Dante in particular was so lost, we must go back even further, and we must ask the question, who is this Dante Alighieri, and how had he come to be so lost? So just pausing as we before we move on to a quick summary of Dante's early life, I just wanted to pause for a moment at this particular painting, which I really like, which is by the Pre-Raphaelite Rossetti, and it's a painting of Giotto painting the portrait of Dante. So it's Rossetti painting Giotto painting Dante, which is I quite like that. But of course, and just incidentally, actually here, Dante and Giotto were acquainted. Some say there was a friendship. We certainly know that when Dante was in exile, he travelled to Padua to admire Giotto's wonderful frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. And he very much liked Giotto's work. He also admired his frescoes depicting the life of St. Francis in Assisi. So they did know of one another's work, and they were, in a way, they were part of the times that have been referred to as the proto-Renaissance, the time before the Renaissance, but when the ideas were all beginning to bubble up, and these two in particular took their forms, Giotto with the frescoes and Dante with the poetry, to new forms of expression that were more personal than had been known before. But anyway, what I've done with this little description of the early years of Dante's life is to put it into the first person, because I thought that might be more fun than just presenting a sort of list of important dates. So I've taken a great liberty, I know, but I hope you'll bear with me. So my name is Dante Alighieri. I was born in Florence in 1265, and I received an initial education, first with Franciscan monks and later at the University of Bologna, where I studied the liberal arts curriculum. My love of poetry began at a very young age. It was brought into being through the death of my mother, my first great agony, and meeting the Lady Beatrice when I was 9 years old, my first great ecstasy. Both of us were betrothed to others and later married, but I continued to adore her. But then, tragically, in 1290, she died suddenly. And in terrible, unquenchable grief, I wrote shortly after La Vita Nuova, the new life, which was a collection of poems and songs written in my lady's praise, which dated back to our very first meeting. In 1265, I drifted into public life, and joined the Guild of Apothecaries, and later became a magistrate of the city. But my grief was deep, and my wounds did not heal. Then, just a few years later in 1302, whilst on a short trip to Rome, a rival faction took power in my dear Florence, and I was exiled on pain of death if I ever returned. Pain of death by fire, I should add, if I ever returned. And very interestingly, you might find that sentence was not revoked by the city of Florence until 2002, quite astoundingly. Dante lived out the rest of his life in his exile. He was divested of all property and all station, and with this terrible threat of death by fire that hung over him. He travelled from city to city, but eventually he settled in Ravenna, where he set himself to writing. His life was hard, we are told, and who knows how long such things can take, but the realization gradually began to dawn upon him that his exile had actually been one of the best things that could have happened, because it set him free from the bonds of political life. It enabled him to look at his former life from an utterly new and different perspective. And crucially, it gave him the opportunity to take up his calling as a writer and a poet. Now, he produced several books on language and philosophy, most notably in 1304, Divulgari Eloquentia, the eloquence of the vernacular. Yet the book that concerns us here, and which really set the scene for his Commedia, is La Vita Nuova, the new life, which he started 2 years after Beatrice's death. And it tells the story of his great love. And it's a lovely little book that I have here, very short, highly recommended. And it's written, not only is it written in the vernacular, but it's written in an autobiographical style, which was at that time two forms that were sort of moving more into prominence, but they were still quite rare in those days. And so the writing that we see in La Vita Nuova, which includes a prose commentary on the poems, is actually very, very fresh and very personal and very raw. And in that sense, it was very attractive and still is to people. So, in this autobiographical style, he writes of the very first meeting of himself and Beatrice. 9 times already since my birth, the heaven of light had almost revolved to the same point when my mind's glorious lady appeared to my eyes. She who was called by many Beatrice, she who confers blessing, by those who did not know what it meant to name her. She had already lived as long in this life as her time in the starry heaven had moved east the 12th part of 1 degree, so that she appeared to me almost at the start of her 9th year, and I saw her almost at the end of my 9th, and she appeared dressed in the noblest colour, restrained and pure and adorned in a style that then suited her very tender years. And at that moment, I say truly that the vital spirit, that which lives in the most secret chamber of the heart, began to tremble so violently that I felt it fiercely in the least pulsation, and trembling, it uttered these words: "Behold, a God more powerful than I, who coming will rule over me." From then on, I say that amour governed my soul, and he commanded me many times to discover whether I might catch sight of this most tender of angels, so that in my boyhood I many times went searching, and I saw her to be of such noble and praiseworthy manner that certainly might be said of her the words of the poet Homer: "She did not seem to be the daughter of a mortal man, but of a god." And so the love affair, well, actually it's not really a love affair at this stage, but his obsession with Beatrice begins, and in this manner it goes on and on and on. And he writes about her again 9 years later, because I think we mentioned last time that this notion of the nines and the threes and the whole Trinitarian structure um, of his writing and his understanding is extremely important. And if you remember, when he comes to write the Divine Comedy, he writes it in this terza rima, this 3-point rhyming style. So everything is related to threes and nines and 30s and so on. Anyway, he writes, "When as many days had passed, that exactly 9 years were completed since the appearance of this most gracious being that I have written of above, it happened that this marvellous lady appeared to me, dressed in the whitest of white, between two gracious ladies who were of greater age. And passing through a street, she turned her eyes to the place where I stood greatly fearful, and with her ineffable courtesy, which is now rewarded in a greater sphere, she greeted me so virtuously, so much so that I saw then to the very end of grace. And in the hope embodied in that marvellous greeting, for me no enemy remained. In fact, I shone with a flame of charity that made me grant pardon to whoever had offended me. And if anyone had asked me anything at that time, my reply would only have been love, love, with the aspect of full humility." He goes on to say, "I left the crowd then as if intoxicated, and I returned to the solitude of my room, and I fell to thinking of this most gracious one." So this is the moment immortalized in the painting by Holiday, a moment when Dante, as he puts it, he sees to the very end of grace. And it's a moment that way, way atop the mountain of the Purgatorio in the earthly paradise, when he first is reunited with Beatrice, she will remind him of. Because it's a moment that sadly and to his shame, he will put to the back of his mind when life soon after deals him a series of very tragic blows. Because not long after, Beatrice dies. This painting, another one by Rossetti, depicts Dante's prophetic dream of the death of Beatrice. In which she's carried away by angels. And when he wakes the following morning, he hopes and he prays it's not true, that it was just a dream. But of course, as we know, it is true. And she is dead and she has gone. How solitary lies the city, he writes upon hearing of Beatrice's death. It has become as a woman widowed in the world. And later he writes, whenever, alas, I remember that I may never again see the lady for whom I so grieve, so much grief is gathered in my heart by the grieving mind, that I say to my spirit, why do you not go, since the torments you suffer in this world, which grows so hateful to you, brings such great thoughts of dread? And then I call on death as to a sweet and gentle refuge, and I say, come to me, with so much love that I am envious of all who die. I think this is beautiful writing of grief, of the loss of the beloved, which some people here might have already experienced in life, and others who haven't experienced it will all dread it. That moment when the most important person in your life is no longer present. And I think Dante beautifully expresses the complete devastation that befalls a person in those situations. Now, the roots of this incredibly romantic style in which Dante expresses all of his feelings about Beatrice, they have deep, deep roots. The style has deep roots, and it reaches, interestingly, all the way back to the Persian Golden Age and the flowering of the Arab mystical love poetry that travelling troubadours brought north to the courts of Moorish Spain, and then onward and upward in the 11th century to the French courts of high romance and courtly love in Provence, presided over, the legend tells, by Eleanor of Aquitaine, who you might have heard of, and her daughter, the Countess of Champagne. Now, the poetry of the Sufi mystics and the Persian love poets told the stories of the soul's love affair with God, whom they called the beloved, a story that leads away from the pain and anguish of longing and separation to reunification. And it's the great mystical journey spoken of in many of the world's wisdom traditions that draws us from ourselves back to the divine nature. The beloved has permeated every cell of my body, says Rumi, writes Rumi. Of myself there remains only a name. Everything else is him. Now, the mystical tradition within Christianity is the equivalent of the Sufi tradition within Islam and to the Kabbalah in Judaism. It is a way of direct union with the divine. Those who know of the Spanish mystic Santa Teresa of Avila will know that she adopted this Sufi terminology of the lover and the beloved to describe the waves of ecstasy that overtook her in the depths of her devotions. And she writes, "Now I want no other love, for I have surrendered myself to God. My beloved is all of me, and I am all for my beloved." I'm sure that you're all very familiar with this marvelous depiction of the ecstasy of Santa Teresa by Bernini at Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. I think many of you will remember Michael Chaffai talking about this piece with us in his marvelous lecture that he did some years ago on the work of Bernini. But thrown into this very interesting mix of factors, we also have at this time a kind of rise in the veneration of the Virgin and a proliferation of paintings that depict this moment, this particular moment of the coronation of the Virgin. And it's very interesting, isn't it? Because as I'm sure you know, the assumption of the Virgin to heaven, body and soul, her becoming the Queen of Heaven, was not officially entered into the canon of the Catholic Church until 1954. 1954. So it's rather fascinating that the image and the depiction of the image was already in people's hearts long, way back in the 12th and 13th centuries. And it was being depicted by numerous artists in Europe. So that's another thing. And I think what this elevation of the Virgin within the culture, in a sense, represents is this seeking for connection with the feminine aspect, which we'll go on to talk about. So, courtly love and chivalry in Provence. Now, you see, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a very powerful woman, very powerful indeed, was very, very inspired by all the mystical poetry that was coming up, arriving from the south into her courts. And together with her daughter and clerics and poets, she began to weave the threads of this sublime devotional style with the elements of chivalry and the elements of courtly love, in which, and this is crucial for us, in which the lady, as an inspiration and a muse, if you like, became encouraged. At this time, the codes of chivalry and courtly love were set down, and they gradually spread throughout the European courts. And it's also the time when the great medieval romances were also first set down. And under Eleanor of Aquitaine's patronage, troubadours sang the praises of ladies, and Platonic liaisons were encouraged, but within boundaries, of course. And those of you who are familiar with the period will know that Andreas Capellanus wrote the rules of courtly love, which set those boundaries. Authors such as Chrétien de Troyes, who first uttered the word Camelot, penned the famous quest for the Holy Grail, as well as the tragic and cautionary tales of Tristan and Isolde and Lancelot and Guinevere, who so influenced Paolo and Francesca, in Canto 5 of Dante's Inferno, which followed much later, of course. But on the deepest level, I've just quoted a little bit from Mara Freeman about the quest for the Grail, because it does overlap with Dante's eventual quest. On the deepest archetypal level, the Grail is a symbol of the soul, which is a feminine word in so many languages. In the Latin, anima, which gives the Gaelic anam, the Greek psyche, and the German Seele, I think that's how you pronounce it. The soul, like the Grail, is hidden away in the dimly lit, tangled forest of the everyday self, sometimes glimpsed as a gleam of light in the far-off window of a distant castle. Yet without connection to the soul, our lands are turned to waste, and this is the great teaching, as true now as it ever was then. And I couldn't help thinking, when looking at this, how similar the Grail nights lost in the forest with the dimly lit castle in the distance was to Canto 1 Inferno, because there, if you remember, Dante can actually see the light, but he can't go directly to it. He has to go through his long process. And I couldn't help thinking that the resonance across all of these tales of the spiritual quest are it's so strong, as Joseph Campbell, I think we might have discussed before, has elucidated for us in his Hero with Thousand Faces. But this quest for love, you see, for reconnection with the deep feminine, is fraught with danger. And in Canto 5, as we've already said, Dante will meet many of those who've lost their way. Characters from the medieval romances, as well as Paolo and Francesca from his own day, and from the classics too, Helen and Paris from Homer's Iliad, who set the whole Trojan War in process, Cleopatra, Queen Dido from Virgil's Aeneid, who took her own life when rebuffed by her lover. And you probably all know, especially the Italians, this very famous Canto 5, the story of Paolo and Francesca is incredibly famous, and I've heard that students in Italy can recite it off by heart. But just in essence, they're reading, they're lovers. Francesca is married. Paolo is the brother of Francesca's husband. They're reading Lancelot and Guinevere. And when they get to the kiss between those two archetypal lovers, they put down the book and they kiss passionately themselves. At which point, Francesca's husband bursts in, discovers them, and in a fit of jealous rage, slays them both. And there they are, thereafter, ever afterwards, in the Inferno, swirling round with all these other characters for whom love has gone tragically wrong. Clearly, you see, the genre of courtly love had drifted away from its sublime roots, and it had devolved into a more secular expression which focused much more on the purely physical dimensions of love. And there were tales of lovesick suitors proliferating, hopelessly caught in love's lustful allure, to the point of not being able to think or to function. And these tales began to dominate. And the beautiful lady who'd once been conceived as the muse, mythologically the daughter of memory, whose role was to uplift the aspirant, to enable him to remember the higher ground, was gradually diminished. But the Italian poets, they all inherited this style. Dante and all the others began in this way, with this Provençal style of courtly love, poetic expression. But over time, they mounted a challenge. And the Tuscan poets like Cavalcanti and Guinezelli, who was Dante's teacher, they began to ask questions about the passions that were aroused by courtly love. What was it, they asked, that caused such tremblings and such uncontrollable palpitations of the heart? What was this love sickness that caused such insomnia and lack of appetite? And how might one stand back and try to understand it a little, try to understand its power? And in asking such questions, they introduced an element of introspection, a bringing of the intellect to bear upon matters of the heart. And in so doing, they created a whole new style of poetry that Dante in the Commedia will call dolce stil nuovo, the sweet new Tuscan style. And within this new genre, if you like, this modified genre, the love of the lady undergoes modification, and she's returned somewhat to her initial heights. And so she's again envisaged more as an angel or a bridge to the divine, as Beatrice will clearly become. And it was a development that returned the genre of love poetry somewhat to its mystical roots as well. But it will be Dante who, in the Commedia, who will fully manifest the notion that, as Giuseppe Mazzotta says in his Yale University lecture on La Vita Nuova, it will become not only a secret erotic dream, but a force that mobilizes the mind to ascend spiritually, and a poetry where love of a woman can take you up to the divinity. Beatrice, even in death, will become for Dante that force, and finally finding his voice as a poet, but also as a man, through the ecstasy, the agonies of love. He will actively propel this genre from what we might call the innocence of youth to the experience of a full maturity. La Vita Nuova is written wholly in the past tense, and Dante experiences the equally debilitating emotions of love and grief, until, the experts point out, one miraculous moment where there is a change of tense. I think I might have discussed this in our session on the Purgatorio, the Garden of Paradise. There's a change of tense. Dante calls it a new perception born of grieving love arose in him, and he suddenly, after the whole thing, uses the verb sperare, to hope. And this is hugely significant, Giuseppe Mazzotta argues, because it signals his ability and his readiness to move on and carry on after Beatrice's death. Soon after, he is graced with the most wonderful vision of Beatrice, and she's sitting at the foot of God's throne. And he feels a calling. He tells us, I saw things that determined that I would say nothing further of this most blessed one until I was able to write about her from truly knowing her. And if it be his pleasure that my life continue with me a few years, Dante writes at the very end of La Vita Nuova, it is my hope that I shall yet write concerning her what hath not before been written of any woman. He does not know what that journey will be, nor what it will entail, but he is convinced at this point that it will lead to a place, a state, if you like, from where love might be better understood, might be understood aright. And this is the hope, this notion of going forward out of his private grief and onward to the future. It will be, as well we know, the greatest work of his life, in which he will elevate the notion of the feminine to another octave completely, so that, alongside the increasingly venerated Virgin, mortal women too, like his beloved, will become imbued with a capacity not only to be man's inspiration, not only to be his bridge, his muse, but to inhabit the highest heavenly realms in their own right, and to guide the unwitting soul, as Dante depicts himself, into the embrace of the divine. Because you see, his quest was never to overcome his love for Beatrice, but to honour it as a powerfully enabling force. For his entire life, Beatrice was the embodiment of that force, so often denied, as we have said, in Christian teaching. Yet, without her, there could have been no Divina Commedia. Without her, way, way, way out ahead of him, his muse, his guide, his angel, as he called her, the story could have never been. His journey will lead to the depths of hell, where the fallen dwell in eternal ignorance, to the healing mountain of the Purgatorio, and finally to the Paradiso, where he will meet again the Lady Beatrice, who will lead him to his final bliss. And in so doing, he will reconnect the genre of love poetry to its highest and most sacred values and to its deepest, deepest roots, fulfilling the promise inherent in the earlier writings of the Persian and Christian mystics and in the visionary writings of Chrétien de Troyes. He will gather the very best of what has preceded him, including the utilization of the intellect, because he was a great fan of Aristotelian ideas. And he will create a masterpiece hitherto undreamed of in the medieval imagination. Dante completed his La Vita Nuova when he was 29 years old. He fulfilled his promise to write a poem worthy of his beloved 27 years later, when just before his death in 1321, he finally completed La Divina Commedia. But for now, we leave him in Ravenna, waiting for the moment to begin his great work.
Grazie mille Caroline. Come sempre, molto molto interessante. I would like just to ask, so thank you, Caroline, very much for that, and ask any of you if you got any question or comments for Caroline. Ben, yeah, if you just unmute yourself. See.
It's very much a man's view of a woman. I know I'm putting a 20th century perspective onto it. We would consider love probably in the 20th, 21st century as a mutual thing, that it's feeling between a man and a woman. And I suppose it was encouraged by the eloquence of poetry, troubadours, paintings at that time, because they were mainly men. Do we know at all how women might have viewed men at that time, and whether their own view of love would have been the same as Dante's, or is that an impossible question to ask?
Well, the times were very different, of course, but I think characters such as, Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was an incredibly powerful woman. And during that particular period, and also her daughter, and at that particular period, men were very often away at the Crusades. This particularly happened to her. And when men were away, women became more powerful at court. In fact, they often ran the court. And I think it's this absence of men, if you like, that enabled these ideas of chivalry and courtly love to come to the fore. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just stop the recording so we can carry on the section of questions. I'll stop the recording 1 second.